Welcome to the Oral History of Criminology project. We are here today in Orlando, Florida, with beautiful weather, at the meeting of the Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences in 2015. My name is Rosemary Barbare, and I am pleased today to interview Matti Joutsen of Finland about his life and distinguished career in criminology and criminal justice. Matti is currently the director of the European Institute in the UN Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice Program, and I've known him for more than 20 years. He has been a visiting professor at John Jay College of Criminal Justice 3 times, and over the time that I've known him, I have learned a great deal about how criminology and criminal justice can be applied and is applied in the workings of international organizations. Matti, can you tell us first how you became involved in criminology, law, and criminal justice?
Well, Rosemary, it's very much a series of coincidences. One is the coincidence that I grew up in 2 different countries. I was born in Finland. My father decided that he'd try to make it in the United States. So when I was fairly young, hadn't even gone into kindergarten, we moved over to the United States. And for the next 10 years, I grew up basically in the United States. English was our home language, absorbed all the cultural messages you get in the United States. Living in California, of course, I grew up with Disney. I was one of the first people to visit the park back in 1955 when it was opened in Anaheim. And then when I was entering my teens, we moved back to Finland. And then I resumed being a European and a Finn. So this, jumping from one country to another, got me interested in looking at life from 2 different perspectives. When I graduated from the secondary school, which I understand in the United States would be called high school, went to the university and I started in political science. This was back in the 1960s, where not only did you have the free speech movement and a lot of other radicalism in Berkeley, but you had the exact same situation in Europe. There was a lot of radicalism in Paris in particular, and it even drifted up to a very calm, staid country like Finland. There was a lot of activity in the university. And I got fairly interested in various forms of protest, various forms of deviance in society. And at that time, there was also the Spiro Agnew scandal, which got me to thinking about corruption in general. And I became interested in corruption. So I took that in my political science studies as the topic of my undergraduate thesis. Had a wonderful summer in Washington, D.C., doing my research at the Library of Congress, and then graduated with a degree in political science, some knowledge of criminology, very little knowledge of anything else that would have any practical relevance in life. So I was looking around for what kind of job I could have, working in a bookstore. Grew up loving books, so that was a fairly natural place for me to work. And I saw a job offer for what was called the Research Institute of Legal Policy that was part of the Ministry of Justice of Finland. And I was interviewed for that. And I think the only thing that caught the interest of my future boss, Professor Ingrid Anttila, was the fact that I was raw, very uncultured when it comes to criminology, just that one undergraduate thesis, but I knew English. And she, at that time, was very interested in broadening her perspectives and wanted to become international. So she hired me basically as an English-speaking person who could help her with translations, etc. But at the same time, she, of course, encouraged my own research in criminology, which I started out with a study on criminology in Finland, which was on corruption in Finland, which was a rather odd topic at that time because, as everyone assumed at that time, corruption was non-existent in Finland, which on the other hand made for a very short study. But So by a series of random coincidences, I got into criminology, started working for Professor Anttila, and that basically determined the general channel of my interest.
Okay. And what were her influences on you? And what major ideas impacted you to continue in criminal justice?
Well, Professor Inkeri Anttila was a rather unusual person at that time. She was the first woman to enter the law faculty. She was the first woman to graduate from the law faculty. She was the first woman to become a professor of criminal law. And at that time, Rosemary, you have to know that the legal profession, the academic profession in Finland and Europe in general was perhaps even more male-oriented than it was in the United States. So for her to become a professor at that time, that was a big deal. And she at the same time was a person who wanted to combine not only academic research, but also the influence of research on practice. And she was, for example, a teacher at the prison department's training school for young guards. And this bridging, as it was, of criminology with practice, taking what she had learned from criminology and then at the same time seeing how it would work in penology, I thought was absolutely fascinating. From that, she graduated into other types of research. She was one of the first people to look at victimization, self-report studies, etc. And working basically as her translator and interpreter for a while, well, basically as a translator, got me more and more interested in how you could bridge the divide between research and practice.
I remember you told me once that working for her, you got your big break.
Working at Helny? Again, there was a series of coincidences there. I joined the Research Institute in 1974. It's getting to be more and more years ago than I care to remember, over 40 years ago. And the very next year, 1975, was one of those big years in the United Nations crime program. Every 5 years, there's this large UN Congress where people from around the world, you have ministers of justice, ministers of Homeland Security, as the reference would probably be in the United States today, national police commissioners, heads of prison services, heads of prosecution services, etc. They would all get together with representatives of the academia, professors, researchers, non-governmental organizations, intergovernmental organizations. They would talk shop, they would talk various issues on crime. Back in 1975, it was all very, if I can use the masculine word, gentlemanly debate. It was primarily a Western European-oriented club, the United Nations at that time. And by coincidence, 1975, when this Congress was held in Geneva, was the Year of the Woman. Professor Inkeri Anttila at that time was the director of the Research Institute, but we had a governmental crisis. In Europe, every now and then you do have these things where the government party would fall away, the president would declare a caretaker government, waiting for the formation of a more stable government.
Mm-hmm.
And just by coincidence, a few weeks before the Congress, our government fell, and Inkeri Anttila was appointed as the Minister of Justice. She had already been planning to go to the Congress. She did go to the Congress. And lo and behold, there were only 2 women at that time who had the same distinguished position as she did. She and Madame Daskalova, who was the Minister of Bulgaria at that time. And the way the United Nations work, they love symbolism. Many organizations, many countries do. She was then, after a very short behind-the-scenes discussion, appointed as the President of the UN Congress, which is an extremely great honor. And of course, she was very much up to it. By a second coincidence, I was not a member of the delegation that was foreseen to go, but one of the members fell ill, so we had an empty slot. Inkeri thought that she might need a secretary to come along, so I was kind of packed into the luggage, found myself in Geneva, and then when she was appointed president, I became basically the acting secretary for Professor Anttila, and having to look at the sidelines while all of the behind-the-scene dealings in the development of policy in the United Nations was going on, I found absolutely fascinating.
And this was one of the first sorts of instances in your work that influenced the questions you've been addressing over your career, right? The 1975 UN Crime Congress. And then further along?
At that time, the UN crime program, which was a fairly small part of the UN program, was trying to expand its reach. The Secretariat, the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime, that's its present name, it has gone through many transmutations, was very small. It was maybe 10 persons all told, I can't remember exactly. But they did have at that time an interregional institute located then in Rome. Its successor is now located in Turin. The people working for the UN program thought that maybe they could expand by establishing regional institutes. And one was established in Tokyo that deals with Asia and the Pacific. And the idea came that perhaps Europe might also have its own regional institute. That was then set up. Very fascinating discussions behind the scene. And the choice was it would go to Helsinki, and the director would be Professor Inkeri Anttila. So again, I was packed up as baggage, taken from the Research Institute of Legal Policy, which looked primarily at Finnish domestic issues, and found myself again working together with the UN on basically European and ultimately global issues.
And your corresponding education, how does that link to that in your own work in criminal justice and law?
Like I said, I started out in political science, was very interested in corruption studies, went into the Research Institute, and Professor Anttila kind of suggested that, well, it's all very well and good to have a political science degree, but in Northern Europe, criminology is associated with the law faculty. So she suggested I go to law school. And she was kind enough to suggest that I could do that also on a Research Institute time. So basically, while I was working for the Research Institute and getting a salary for that, I was also able to go to law school. And basically, I was able to combine these two with one another. I was able, later on, having graduated from the law faculty at the end of the 1970s, to continue academically. At that time, victimology was a fairly new area of interest, and I became very interested in looking at how the victim was dealt with in different countries. Again, Professor Anttila was very interested in comparing how different countries dealt with the same type of issue, because ultimately all countries do have to respond to the same type of basic issues. What do you do when a juvenile steals? What do you do when a man beats his wife or spouse or partner? What do you do when a group goes out and robs a bank? What kind of a response do you develop? How do you investigate it? And what do you do with the persons if found guilty? Now, those are problems we all share, and yet we seem to believe that our criminal justice system, whatever our criminal justice system is, has the right answers, and the way that we do things is the proper way to respond. It's a very ethnocentric idea. So Professor Anttila, when she started running the Research Institute, Heuni, thought that what we should try to do is look at how different European countries respond to one specific issue. We would gather information from all of the countries, and she had a wonderful network of colleagues throughout the European region, both East and West. Back in the 1970s, there was a very sharp divide. The Iron Curtain was existent, but still Professor Anttila was able to bridge these two. One of the first issues was on victim policy, and that got me interested in seeing how differently victims are dealt with, even though from the perspective of the victim herself or himself, the experience is very much the same. So I then continued and did my doctoral dissertation on victim policy in different European countries.
So you have quite an interdisciplinary background that was done almost the entire time that you were also working in criminal justice policy and analysis. Okay, so which really founded the basic for your career, the basis, which was connecting what you might be reading or analyzing in your education to practical implications for policy or application in the field. Okay.
Well, basically working for HUNI, the European Regional Institute, taught me that the different countries in the European region, when responding to the same problems, they develop their responses within the framework of a legal tradition, of their own legal system. And they believe that their responses are totally logical and also the best appropriate ones for their system. And yet when we started looking at issues from a European perspective, and at that time, mind you, no matter what country you represented, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, the USSR, Bulgaria, we all thought that we had invented the Holy Grail.
Mm-hmm.
But when we started discussing, and when you got experts at the level that Professor Antila was able to attract to our conferences, they started realizing that, wait, what those people are talking about, that might work in my own country. Just to take an example, when a victim is brought to court, in the common law system, the victim at the most is a witness, if called by the state. In socialist countries at that time, the victim to a large extent was part of the process. In my own country, Finland, the victim could even join in the prosecution. If the public prosecutor, in a case of, say, domestic violence, wanted the husband prosecuted for petty assault, a fairly trivial offense, and the wife said, "Oh no, what he did to me was very serious. I want him prosecuted for aggravated assault." She can prosecute for that, totally irrespective of what the prosecutor did. And when looking at how these countries were developing their system, I was able to see what I would call functional equivalence. In socialist countries, in some of the Nordic countries, and a few other countries, the victim is allowed to join in the proceedings, the criminal proceedings, as a party. In other countries, the victim was allowed to join in as a complainant and to ask for compensation within the criminal process. In common law countries, that wasn't possible. And yet later on, the United Kingdom, for example, developed what's called a compensation order, which is one way of providing compensation to the victim within the confines of criminal justice or criminal procedure. And when I followed how these were developing in different countries, there tended to be a kind of convergence in interest in strengthening the position of the victim, but they manifested themselves in different ways in different countries.
So a very important lesson. Can you tell us, Matti, besides your work in victims, what other major themes have you embarked on in your body of work overall?
When I first was working for the Research Institute, which was part of the Ministry of Justice, it was primarily domestic issues. So I looked at issues like juvenile delinquency or the use of solitary confinement or economic crime issues within the confines of one country. When I transferred to HUNI, as I said, I started getting interested in the comparativist approach. But again, through a series of coincidences, Finland joined the Council of Europe, which is a structure that promotes a lot of practical cooperation between the authorities, the justice authorities, the law enforcement authorities, etc. And then in the middle of the 1990s, when Finland joined the European Union, I started working with the European Union, which worked in much the same areas as the Council of Europe, but with an emphasis on what I would call hard law, or what is known as hard law, where the European Union itself would develop a framework decision, an instrument, which would be in itself binding on all of the countries. They were looking within the European Union at harmonization of legislation on some key offenses, but they were also looking at transnational cooperation. And that got me more and more interested in how countries would cooperate in what I call transnational criminal justice. What do you do when an offender robs a bank in one country and then flees to another country? What do you do when a victim on vacation down in Italy returns to Germany but still wants that case prosecuted either in Italy or Germany? She doesn't care as long as it's done. Or what do you do when a crime committed in one country, like a cybercrime, then has impacts in other countries? So from national criminal justice issues, I went on to comparative issues, and then finally to transnational issues.
Mm-hmm. And you were very much involved with the UN Convention on Transnational Organized Crime. Can you tell us about that? Would you say that is your contribution that you look at with the most pride?
Like I said, I became interested in criminology by the coincidence of being able to speak English. And that brought me working within the United Nations. Under Professor Anttila, I was able then to join in or hook into more and more of the policy structures of the Council of Europe, the European Union, and especially because of Professor Anttila, into the United Nations. So by the time the Transnational Organized Crime Convention was being negotiated at the end of the 1990s, I was already heavily involved in the work of the Council of Europe and the European Union. And in those areas, especially in the European Union, we were talking about how you respond to transnational organized crime. And a lot of cooperation has been developed within the European Union between countries that have a totally different legal tradition, a totally different legal system, totally different administrative system. And yet we were able, and we continue to be able to find solutions to these problems. So when a political impetus developed for developing a hard law instrument within the United Nations to deal with transnational organized crime, which would bind countries as diverse as Singapore and Botswana, Nicaragua and Ireland, I found myself negotiating on behalf of the Finnish delegation on a convention which at the outset, none of us were really certain where it's going to be. We had huge debates over how do you define organized crime? How do you define transnational organized crime? And we would go around and around this. It was a very difficult question for all of us. And the chairman would throw up his hands, wonderful Italian, would throw up his hands and say, no, we can't agree on this. Why don't we start looking at the different substantive issues on extradition, mutual legal assistance, etc. And then we would get to those issues, and then we would find that, well, we can't really decide on extradition until we know what kind of offenses we're going to be extraditing for, because that would set the level of seriousness. So we kept on going around and around and around in a circle. And I found the fact that I had a fairly good comparativist background, and this was the secret. I was able to draft in English. I was able, together with colleagues, leading colleagues from a number of countries, Poland, the Netherlands, Germany, the United Kingdom, Canada, all very influential. We found that a small group of people, if they really did their homework, if they really prepared, and they were able to work the aisles, get into public relations type of exercises behind the scenes, we were able to get text on the table, which we were able to push through. Now, I was a fairly junior person at that time, and my colleagues, many of them had more practical experience than I did, but they weren't policymakers. And yet we found that if you have people representing different systems that in a sidebar discussion could agree that this is something that would work, and we would then put it on the table, quite often we could use rational arguments to get this through. The UNTOC discussions, the United Nations Transnational Organized Crime Convention discussions, was a body primarily of practitioners, experts, policymakers who had a background in criminal justice. And I found it very easy to meld in with this one because we were talking the same language. We knew the reality of how our criminal justice systems operate and what the difficulties were, and we were trying to find ways to bridge these gaps. And, well, after 3 years, out of which I spent, in my calculations, 6 months in Vienna drinking melange. You need a lot of melange when you negotiate these UN sessions because they can go on a very long time. We were able to reach consensus on what ultimately proved to be a very influential convention, which now has about 190 signatories.
And for the uninitiated, what is so great about this particular convention, Matti?
If you go as recently as back in the 1980s, there were very few multilateral conventions. In 1988, towards the end of the 1980s, we've had the first really global convention within the United Nations framework called the UN Drug Convention. Well, that's the way it's known as, the 1988 Drug Convention, which combined not only criminalization, telling all of the member states that you have to criminalize certain drug crimes, but also, and this was the first time, combined those criminalizations with provisions on extradition, mutual legal assistance, technical assistance, and a few other issues. That was the first time we had a structure that could allow countries as diverse as, like I said, Singapore and Botswana, etc., to cooperate. The United Nations Transnational Organized Crime Convention expanded the same type of idea, combining criminalization with mutual legal assistance, extradition, technical assistance, and a few other mandatory provisions, to the issue of transnational organized crime in general. And before that, all we had were bilateral agreements, and a few very small regional conventions. But this was the first time we had something truly global.
Okay. All right, moving on a bit, as we reflect upon your career, what would you say your identifying characteristics as a scholar are? How do you think you'll be remembered?
Other than being a specialist on Disney in good and bad, I don't know if I would be remembered. Working as I do within the United Nations, most of the work I've been doing has been national policy papers or contributions to national policy papers, contribution to UN Secretariat reports. But I've found that having started out in criminology, having I worked for a while as a lower court judge in Finland, and then at a later stage I worked on extradition, mutual legal assistance, other international affairs for my government, the Ministry of Justice of Finland. So I had the research orientation, I had some sense of what problems practitioners have in practice, and then to be able, working with the Council of Europe, the European Union, and in particular the United Nations, to influence policy. So I would say if there was some trait or some feature that would dominate my career, certainly towards the end, would be this combination of academia, practice, and policymaking.
Do you ever find yourself reflecting on how younger scholars are trained and wishing that they'd been trained differently? Do you have any advice for younger scholars?
The way that my life has developed, at least my professional life, I came in at a time when transnational criminal justice, in other words, the development of cooperation between countries, was really in its infancy. And over the past 20 years, looking at how the United Nations has been working, how the European Union has been working, and how some individual countries, in particular the United States, has been working, there has been a huge growth in the need for transnational criminal justice and also the ability of countries to respond to those needs. So,
do you think the younger scholars are being trained to respond to that need or not?
Well, what I'm trying to say is that I started at the beginning, I don't think I could have made any other choices, because when I started back in the 1970s, there was no transnational criminal justice. But now, 2015, the need for transnational criminal justice, the need for any practitioner in any country to understand how cooperation works transnationally, internationally, globally, whatever term you want to use, has grown immensely. Think about a chief of police in Iowa, for example, or a prosecutor in North Dakota. Back in the 1970s when I started, their cases would have been local, at the most national. Well, maybe in North Dakota you could have had a few cases of people coming across from Canada, but those types of cases would be few and far between. Today, even people in North Dakota or Iowa, or whatever, they will come across cases where the witness will disappear to another country, the suspect will be a fugitive in another country, evidence has to be sought from another country. They would have to have some kind of inkling of how the system works transnationally. So practitioners need this information. As for research, the field has been evolving so rapidly, it's mind-boggling. Now, as I said, I started in political science, I went on to law, and I know that law evolves very slowly. But in this field of criminal law, which is perhaps one of the slowest fields to evolve, it has been extremely rapid. And to just take one example of that, the offense of money laundering. Today we all know what money laundering is about, but go back 30 years, and there was no such concept in 1985. It was in 1986 when the United States criminalized money laundering for the first time. And if you look at what happened from 1986 to the year 2000, which is only 14 years, from 1986, the United States criminalized this. Soon after that, you had the establishment of the Financial Action Task Force, 1989. 1990, the Financial Action Task Force adopted their 40 recommendations on how to respond to money laundering. 1988, 2 years after the United States criminalized money laundering, the 1988 Drug Convention incorporated a requirement that all signatories must criminalize money laundering. And if you stop to think what this means, the United States had to go to policymakers in all of the negotiating countries and explain to them what is money laundering, which, when you stop to think about it, for many of these policymakers would be a totally bizarre question. Why would I want to put money into a washing machine? What does this concept mean? So you have to explain to them what the concept is. You have to explain why it's important to have international cooperation in the repatriation of assets, in tracing, freezing, seizing the assets. So to go from 1986 to 1980, a U.S. invention of the concept, to getting it adopted in the United Nations Convention, the Drug Convention, to 1990, where you have the Financial Action Task Force recommendations. Same year in 1990, the Council of Europe adopted a money laundering convention, which required that all of the member states criminalized it. And then fast forward to the year 2000, when the Transnational Organized Crime Convention was adopted. That again had money laundering as one of the offenses that all of the countries have to criminalize. So from 1986, the United States was the only country to criminalize it, to the year 2000, where all of the signatories had to criminalize it. That's a short period in a person's life. That's a short period in the evolution of law, but it reflects how quickly things will move and how much there's a need for research in seeing what set off this development and what impact will this have and what will be the necessary next steps.
How would you characterize the current state of the field? And what would be gaps that we should turn our attention to? What first is the current state of the field from where you sit?
Well,
criminal
justice. A little more
justice.
specific.
Of
Criminal
criminal
justice in
justice.
general, comparative criminal justice, transnational
Criminal justice in general, and then the areas that you're most expert in.
Well, I think I'd like to focus more on transnational criminal justice. It's an extremely rapidly evolving field, like I said. And I would say, looking at how it has evolved since the 1980s, the United States has been the primary actor. And I say the, they determine article the, but advisedly, because the United States, the influence of the United States on transnational criminal justice since Nixon declared his war on crime and declared that drugs is the number one global priority. Since that time, the United States has used a measure of different techniques. They have used bilateral, multilateral negotiations. They have used technical assistance. They have used economic sanctions, believe it or not. They have used naming and shaming, which is very rarely used in the United Nations in criminal justice areas. They have used outsourcing, and I'm sorry to throw these terms at you, but the United States has been able to combine a number of different techniques to get other countries to understand what innovations are needed. I used money laundering as one example. The various offenses related to corruption would be a second example. Modern investigative means like buy and bust tactics, undercover investigation, electronic surveillance, all of these were totally unknown to many countries when the United States started working. And so the United States from the mid-1980s on has been very successful in setting the agenda for transnational criminal justice and in getting other countries to follow suit. 1995, when the European Union started getting into what the European Union calls home and justice affairs, which is basically, from an American audience, it's homeland security and justice. The European Union has been extremely influential in developing transnational criminal justice within the European Union. Now consists of 28 countries. Back in 1995 it was 15 countries, which by the way is reflective of the speed in which things are developing. From that period, the European Union started developing a host of different tools, mutual recognition of arrest warrants, for example, peer review on the broad spectrum of criminal justice issues, the establishment of Europol, the establishment of Eurojust, the development of framework decisions with which all member states had to basically implement as soon as they were adopted. This allowed the European Union to set the agenda within the European Union, but at the same time it led to the development of totally new tools which wouldn't have been possible otherwise. Tools which the European Union, through the Transnational Organized Crime Convention negotiations, was able to insert into a global convention and again influence developments elsewhere. So we've gone from a period where the United States has been setting the agenda to a period where the European Union is contributing it. We're now entering into a stage where we seem to be entering into a multipolar world, where within the United Nations in particular, there has been a process of politicization. It's very unfortunate. Again, there's various factors that have led to that development. One of them being that the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, they're responsible for a huge range of issues, from how you deal with juvenile delinquents, to how you deal with victims, all the way through to corrections, improving the police, improving the judiciary, etc. And every country has their own priorities. American priorities, they're not shared by all countries. You go to a country like Botswana, or Singapore, or Russia, or China, they have their own priorities. And within the United Nations, we have to try to find a balance between these different priorities. And it's getting more and more difficult because the people going to the meetings in Vienna tend to be more and more diplomats who don't have a grounding in criminal justice. And I have the greatest respect for diplomats, but you cannot be an expert on, shall we say, drugs and crime one day. The next day you get into nuclear energy. The third day you're talking about outer space issues. You cannot be an expert on all of these, so you're going to have to rely on your colleagues back in the capital. And yet these diplomats have to be able to respond very quickly when someone in negotiations proposes new wording. like was done during the transnational organized crime negotiation proceedings. I would come up with a piece of paper and I would distribute this and say this is the proposal of Finland. They're going to have to respond to this almost immediately. And yet, while we have the negotiations in Vienna ongoing, people back in Beijing will have gone to bed. People in Washington, they haven't yet come to the office. So the people on the spot, the diplomats, they have the hard job of having to respond very quickly. And quite often, they would then respond by simply trying to call on what they believe are their national priorities. And this has led to a situation where decisions are becoming, unfortunately, bogged down by national priorities, where you don't have the true criminal justice knowledge, the criminal justice perspective, where you don't have the experts talking to one another. On that level, we could probably find consensus very easy. But once you start getting national priorities in, it becomes unfortunately much more difficult.
What do you see as the gaps in the field, or what questions should the field be turning its attention to, especially with this growing politicization of criminal justice at the global scale?
The United States, when it started its global war on crime, and this was then expanded to other areas, trafficking in persons, for example, corruption, etc., they were able to suggest new criminalizations, new techniques, new policies, which have, I would say, fairly effectively been globalized. The European Union has been able to provide its own contribution later on. But we still are in a situation where we only have 3 truly global conventions. The 1988 Drug Convention, United Nations, these are all 3 United Nations conventions. The 2000 Transnational Organized Crime Convention, which deals only with fairly serious organized crime activities, and the United Nations Convention on Corruption. Very serious problem, but it's only corruption. So that leaves a whole slew of hard issues out there that on which we have not yet been able to find a response. So I could mention a whole number of different issues on which we don't have consensus on what would be the hard law, the policy that all countries have to follow. Cybercrime is one which is extremely politicized within the United Nations. There's a Council of Europe convention from the year 2000. It's known as the Budapest Convention, which does deal with cybercrime, and it is very much up to date. It covers the hard issues, but for political purposes, unfortunately, those countries that were not involved in this negotiation are not ready to sign up to it, and they would like to have a UN convention. And this is an extremely difficult issue. Cybercrime is a huge issue which is going to become more and more burning. We already have had denial of service attacks that have a transnational dimension. The attack on Sony, where the Sony computer was hacked and information was then provided or publicized, which was not only embarrassing, but there was obvious criminal justice implications there. These are only examples of, I would say, milder forms of cybercrime. More serious cybercrime can happen, and we have to find a way of agreeing within the global structure. How do we respond to this? How do we get all of the countries on the same page? There are other types of issues. Trafficking in cultural property is something that's often mentioned. Many other issues which need to be covered. But even those that we do have already, like the Organized Crime Convention, the Corruption Convention, we have a huge number of signatories. But so far we don't have an effective way of reviewing the implementation of these conventions. Within the Council of Europe, within the European Union, we do have a fairly effective peer review mechanism which is able to bring the experts together around a table. For example, on money laundering, you would get experts from 2 countries to go to the country under review, talk with their experts. How is your country responding to money laundering? What's your financial institutions, or what are your financial institutions doing? What is your legislation like? What are your police priorities? What are the resources that you give the police in detecting money laundering and investigating. And it's in this kind of expert-to-expert discussion that you learn a lot. Not only the country under review learns a lot, but also the countries that do the review learn a lot. This isn't so far working as effectively as it should work in the United Nations. And there's a huge amount of good things that we can do in preventing corruption, in preventing organized crime. In other words, on existing hard law, which isn't being done yet.
Okay. Is there anything else you'd like to add, Matti?
Well, I'm sure there's lots, but I think I've pretty much, shall we say, abused your patience here, Rosemary.
Thank you for a wonderful conversation.
And Rosemary, thank you for very good questions.